Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Parish of the Good Shepherd in Waban, Massachusetts for the second Sunday in Lent. This is our adult form series where we are examining W.H. Vanstone's text, The Stature of Waiting. I have it here again. As always, I commend this text to you. If you'd like to go out and buy this book, you absolutely may. At the same time, you do not have to own this book and you do not have to read this book in order to participate in our adult forum. I will be explaining our chapter for this week, and if I've done my job correctly, you'll know what the chapter is about, and therefore will be able to participate in our discussion afterwards. As always, I will be recording this first half of our adult forum, so that if you missed something, you can always go back to our parish YouTube page and watch this presentation. And if you missed our adult forum this Sunday after all, and are watching us now on YouTube, well, you know why you're here. So to begin, I will share my screen because, as always, I have a presentation. Great. My hope is that you're now seeing that. Stature of Waiting by Vanstone, second Sunday in Lent. As always, we'll go and look at our structure of the book. Today, in the second Sunday of Lent, we will be reading chapter 3, which is entitled The Status of Patient. If you remember, last week, Vanstone examined the gospel passages about Jesus and Jesus's passion, really looking back at the original Greek to discover what was happening. And he saw that there was a transition point in Jesus being handed over that changed from his active ministry into the passion, and that the passion really meant that Jesus was the object of other people's actions. This week, we're going to be looking at the status of patient, which means, what about us? Do we do something similar in our lives? Are there points where we transition into passion? And so Vanstone really asks, how do we step into passion? And to answer this, firstly, I think I'd like to go back to etymology. This is one of my interests, so please bear with me. This is not really in Vanstone's book, but I do think that it needs to be elucidated because Vanstone really sort of skips over it quite clearly. So let's go back to the Greek, shall we? There is a Greek verb, which is pasho, which means to be done to. Pasho really is the opposite of the verb to do. If you're going to do something, this is to be done to, right? So it's sort of a reflexive verb. And from pasho, that's translated in Latin as patior. And patior has a whole host of meanings in Latin. It can mean to suffer or to endure, or to allow or to permit, to submit or acquiesce. This is, again, I think I mentioned last week that Latin really is kind of like a sponge. It absorbs a lot of meanings from other languages, and it sort of spits out a lot of other meanings in the languages that are translated from it. And for us English speakers, patior is the progenitor verb for a lot of different words in the English language that come to us down through, actually through the French, right? So the first, I would say, is patiens, and patiens is the present active participle of patior. And from that, we get words like patient and patience, and passio, which is the perfect participle of patior with a little tio ending on that, we get the words passive and passivity, and passion, like the passion of Jesus Christ, right? So if you look at our English lexicon, we have this host word, patior, which can have a whole diversity, a whole constellation of meanings, right? And patior itself sort of absorbs a lot of meanings, certainly from Greek. It has this original word of pasho, but we also know that there's some Proto-Indo-European words, probably from the Etruscan, that also come into Latin to influence that. And I will say that there is another meaning of pasho, right? Which is Paschal, like the Paschal Lamb or the Paschal Feast. And the Greeks were actually trying to translate the Hebrew word Pesach, right? And please forgive me if I'm butchering that because I don't speak Hebrew. But Pesach was translated as Pasho, right? Like it's there. But interestingly, we get from that Paschal. And I will say that this verb patior, right, and this whole sort of sponginess of Latin We've seen before, if you remember last week, Vanstone did address this in those two Greek verbs, paradidomi and prodidomi, how they're both translated as trado, and trado sort of encapsulates all of this meaning and sort of spits out a whole constellation of verbs and nouns in English, everything from trader to tradition. And if you're working from the English and you're working backwards through the Latin, you sort of have to understand what you're getting at. And I will say with patior, right, there's all these different meanings from suffer and endure to allowing and permit, but the suffering here is a lot like we have it in sort of the King James version of the gospel when Jesus says, suffer the little children to come unto me, right? He doesn't mean little children cause me pain. It's not suffering as in pain. It's suffering as in allowing or permitting the little children to come onto me. So we have this really broad sense of being done to. I do think that the Latin encapsulates the Greek very well here in patior. And this is sort of our starting off point for chapter 3, when Vanstone asks, how do we step into passion? Well, we're going to look at this very sort of Patian's translation of patior, which is patient. We step into passion through patience, through being a patient. In the classical sense of what a patient is, someone in a hospital. And so he has an example, right? Someone struck down by an accident or a debilitating illness suddenly becomes a patient. Now, they may be very active in their life and they may be doing something, but all of a sudden in this act of, in this action, this being struck down, they transition very rapidly into the status of a patient. And they are the object of other people's actions. So they are transported to a hospital, they are examined, they are monitored, they're eased or sustained, their pain is sustained or eased by drugs or by drips, and they're reassured, they're visited by friends. All of what happens to this person and is done to this person, right? And if we were to translate that sentence back into the Greek, that is done to, really, that is pasho in Greek. The patient is in passion, right? He is the object of the decisions and the care and treatment of others. But Vanstone says, this is not the only time when we step into passion, when we become the object of others. Certainly accidents happen and that happens, but there's other times in our life as well. And he says, well, what about the end of life, right? So the victim of a serious road accident or certain kinds of illness passes suddenly into the condition or status of a patient. But many other people make the same transition gradually and imperceptible by stages, through advancing years, through increasing infirmity, and slowly changing circumstances. And he says, towards the end of our life, some degree of dependence on others is normal. It's expected. We accept the likelihood, even the inevitability, that the very last phase of our life will be a second childhood, in which we shall be no less dependent on the care and attention of others than we were in our infancy. Right? So old age at the end of life is another stage in our life when we are in passion, when we are the object of other people's actions. And Vanstone says, well, what about other times, right? What about before the end of life, before old age, when we are in retirement, right? We're not elderly yet, but we're retired. What happens in retirement? And he sort of explains that in retirement, there's this sort of distinctive fact of retirement. What retirement means is that we're no longer achieving by our daily work the wherewithal to live, right? Our pension or the income from savings on which we now live may have been earned in the past, but it is not being earned by our present activity. Vanstone says that a retired person may be active in very many ways, right? But his activity is no longer self-supporting or self-sustaining. By his day-to-day activities, he's not putting a roof over his head, food on the table, the necessities and luxuries which constitute the standard of his living, right? And he also says in retirement, often we are the object of other people's attention and availability. And he has this wonderful example of parents, right? At one time, parents will have arranged treats and excursions for their young children, but now in retirement, they find such arrangements made for them by their adult sons and daughters. Retired people usually find that their life now contains a larger proportion of waiting upon the availability and convenience and arrangements of other people. And he has this sort of barbed line, I think. One may continue to be active in many ways in retirement, but it is no longer possible to regard one's activities with entire seriousness, which, is a bit of a, a bit of a judgment. But I think what he means there is that what you're doing in retirement is not absolutely necessary to living, right? It's this wonderful joy, but it's not essential. It's not keeping that roof over your head or food on your table. So retirement is another time when we are gradually moving into passion. What about other times? He asks. Well, unemployment is a big one. And if you think about what was happening in 1982 in the United Kingdom when he wrote this book, there was a massive realignment of the British economy, and there was very, very high unemployment. It was, in some senses, an existential crisis for the United Kingdom. Everyone was talking about unemployment, especially how the working classes, the poor, were very much afflicted by unemployment. And he talks about unemployment in depth, but he also sort of goes into a sci-fi mode. He says, unemployment doesn't necessarily need to be linked to poverty. And he imagines a world where, aided by technology, the level of productivity rises with the loss of jobs, right? This might be where we're at now in the 21st century, but there will always be a divide between those who provide for themselves and those who are provided for by others, right? So unemployment is this existential state of being in some ways, that you are being provided for by others. And regardless of whether your life is good or not, whether you're well provided for, whether you have food on that table, a roof over your head, there's a sense that being provided for is less than if you could provide for yourself. So, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. Vanstone asks, are there other times in our life when we slip into passion, when we sort of move into this area of dependence? And he says, actually, it's increasingly the case, even in our active life, in our working life, this is happening. The increasing prevalence of the status of patient. Right? So he says, we live in an increasingly complex world. This is a very, very complex world to live in today. And it is less and less the case that we are sort of sole actors, sole agents, and in charge of our own destiny. We belong to this complex system, and our experience in it is that we are a cog in the wheel. And our success and our satisfaction at work come not from our personal strengths, skills, or diligence, but really from the absence of any problems caused by other people, right? And he sort of has the example of, does your boss give you clear directions? Do you get that report from a colleague that enables you to do your work? If you get all those things, you can achieve and succeed at your job. But if you don't, you're kind of stymied. And that's really our experience of work now, that it's all dependent upon other people's accomplishments and whether we can do our job because other people have done their job. He also looks at sort of all facets of life now. Relaxation, he says, is increasingly passive rather than participatory. He even talks about travel. He kind of sounds like a crabby old man in this part of the book. We no longer travel. We are transported, on airplanes or in our cars. And the success of our journey depends not on our planning, on our sort of being able to forge ahead with the journey, but on external factors like, whether we hit roadwork or traffic congestion, or if our car breaks down, because AAA is there to save us, right? We don't fix our own engines. We let other people fix our engines for us. And he has this quote: "The complex environment of modern man, an environment that includes everything from the cables hidden under the ground to the information stored in computers to our own credit ratings and the fluctuations of the money market, certainly does not present itself to the individual as an instrument or servant of which we are the master. Often it presents itself as a capricious overlord of which we are at best the beneficiary and at worst the victim." So he says, the reality is, I think, there are obviously parts of our life, little enclaves or even wide areas in which we still exercise large and unfettered freedom. But Vanstone's point is that those areas are tending to diminish, right? And it would take deliberate efforts to sort of survive outside of the system. If you're going to be a part of society, you are increasingly in the status of patient, that you are increasingly in passion and dependent upon all sorts of factors largely out of your control. He has the classic example of what happens if your power goes out. You can't do anything. You have to wait until someone very far away turns the power back on. That's sort of the classic example of us being dependent upon this world that we live in. So, and he has other examples too, right? He has a little discourse on the space shuttle, right? He talks, and this is again the early 80s, so the space shuttle was this great triumph in American aeronautical engineering. NASA created the space shuttle. And he said that when the engineers were assessed after the space shuttle program had been created about their experiences of creating the space shuttle, everyone thought, oh, they're going to talk about how proud they were, how happy they were, how satisfied they were in creating this great triumph of engineering. And he says, actually, most engineers, their experience was one of frustration. Frustration because everyone was dependent upon everyone else in the NASA system, that no engineer could progress in their work until they had gotten assessment reports and results from experiments from other engineers. And it was just a massive pyramid of interdependence and dependence. And therefore, everyone's primary experience was one of frustration. And another example, one that I'm going to introduce this week, is the pandemic response, right? This is why I wanted to read this book and why I'm introducing it to the parish for this Lent, because this entire year has been an experience of frustration, an experience of dependence, right? So we have governments telling us which businesses have to shut down, capacity limits for people who are in attendance. And even if you're in the church, the bishops have restrictions and guidelines that we have to follow. It is an entire experience of other people making determinations for us and restricting our lives in very many ways. And I'll mention in this past week, there's been a large experience of patience, of being impassioned with regards to getting the vaccine. The news stories for the past week have been news stories of frustration of people, now that all those over age 65 can get the vaccine, logging on to the patient portals and entering all their insurance information all the way to get to the end to find out there are no more slots available. And this is frustrating. So people would keep logging on again and again and again, entering their information, trying to get a slot for a vaccine. And it's interesting that through their lens, they are the actor. They're the ones putting in information. They're the ones trying very hard. They are waiting for hours and hours and hours. But really, the reality is whoever designed the patient portals, the sign-up system, did a very bad job. They crashed because there were too many people trying to sign up all at once. And really, this experience of dependence is what we are trying to experience, but we're trying to express that through our own agency. And the reality is the reality of the situation, the existential reality, is one where we are literally patients, that we are dependent upon the actions and decisions of other people. These are the two big examples. There are three theses. Once you sort of lay this out, it becomes clear in Vanstone's chapter 3 that he has 3 points. First point, and I think we've covered this and we can all agree, is that our life can be divided into periods of action, periods of passion, periods when we are the actors and the subjects of our own life, the independent actors really, and times when we are dependent on others and we're the object of other people's actions. That's his first point. I don't think it's very controversial. The second point is that we are increasingly becoming patients in our own lives, even in areas of activity, even in areas where we would presume that we're independent and that we're free. Because of the complexity of the world that we live in, we are actually more dependent upon others than we might let on, right? That this is increasingly the case in our work lives, in our travel lives, in our relaxation lives, in our pandemic lives, right? We are much more dependent upon this very complex system that we live in than we let on. And his third point is that we resent that. We're very unhappy being dependent. Our conscious and explicit attitudes to the status of patient are almost all wholly negative, he says. And he also writes that even if we largely acquiesce to becoming patient or being provided for, we nevertheless regret it or resent it. And in our inward thoughts and in our outward discussions with other people, we express this resentment, right? We don't actually fight against being dependent, but we don't see any worth or value in it. And where it is possible to assert or to pretend to have independence, we do so. And we're expected to do so by others. So some examples of pushing back against being dependent, right? old age, when people are very elderly, we often compliment them on being, oh, still so active or still so independent. It doesn't matter what they're doing. The fact that they are in any capacity active or independent is praiseworthy, which is an interesting way of putting it, right? And they very well may be cared for or supported or helped by others. In fact, most people in old age are, but we don't force that reality onto people and say, point out, oh, look how this person's helping you, that person's helping you too, because that actually might, injure their dignity or their self-respect. He also mentions that, in a very conscious way, we talk not about assistance or handouts from the government. We talk about entitlements. Everything that is provided for has been earned. That, in your old age, you deserve all of this. And it's because of your previous agency that you've earned all of this assistance. And it's not talked about as assistance. So we really focus on and highlight activity, even at old age, even at the end of our life. We talk about how we can be still active. And retirement. So let's rewind a bit into our golden years. How many of us have said in retirement, oh, we're busier than ever, right? We highlight how retirement should be filled with creative leisure, new interests, and new hobbies. And if we're not so engaged, then we will be, or should be, feel diminished, says Vanstone. He sort of imagines someone who in retirement is just content to lie back in a hammock and watch the world go by. There might be some people who feel that way, but we kind of look at them askance, right? Like, do something already. Like, you have all this free time now. Why aren't you doing something creative or interesting? You're just going to sit there, wait for death? Doesn't seem very good. That's not a good use of your life. Unemployment. We push back against unemployment. And very classically, unemployment is derided as a degrading condition. A person who in the prime of life is receiving rather than achieving his likelihood is by that very fact diminished in dignity. This is sort of the prevailing notion of what unemployment is. And of course, injury and illness. Nobody likes to be injured. Nobody likes to be sick. And if we are injured or sick, we're focused primarily on recovery, on enablement, on getting back to where we were. But we so focus on recovery and enablement that if that is not achievable, we've actually devalued those who fail to recover, those who choose not to recover. And he has two examples, one of a paraplegic and another of an amputee. You'll discover as we read Vanstone, he has these wonderful little vignettes, these stories that he tells, and I think they're interesting to read, but they're also revealing in a certain way. So imagine someone who has suddenly become paraplegic. Well, what's going to happen is they're going to be rushed to a ward in a hospital that focuses on physical therapy, that's going to focus on strengthening them, getting them back to a place where they can be independent, where they can care for themselves. All well and good, but what happens if someone cannot recover to the point where they're independent anymore? Well, Vanstone says they're shuffled off to a different ward in the hospital. And this may have been the case in the early 80s in the UK. I don't know if it is now, but this other ward is one where it's much bleaker, much more grim. There's less to do. It's less engaging. The staff there are more dour. They're not as involved in their patients. And it sort of feels like a resignment. It's sort of, this is where you've been put because you failed. You could not recover to the level where people wanted you to recover. And therefore, this is your life now. It's almost a devaluation of a person. And he also has this example of someone who's an amputee, who's lost their leg, right? And they have to be pushed around in a wheelchair by their spouse. And now what happens if we give that amputee a prosthetic leg? So now he could, with physical therapy, walk around and sort of take care of himself all on his own. Well, imagine this scenario where this husband and wife, this couple, actually enjoy being in a wheelchair and being pushed around, that actually there's a sense of closeness that this man who's an amputee feels when his wife pushes him around. He likes to chat with her. He likes to spend his day with her. And his wife doesn't at all feel like this is a burden to push him around in a wheelchair. In some ways, this is a much better life than him having a leg and being able to walk around and do things all on his own. What would it say if even after receiving a prosthetic leg, he opted to sit in a wheelchair and be pushed around by his wife? And his wife enjoyed that, right? Regardless of their personal preference, we as a society would say, oh no, you can't do that. You have a leg now. Get up and walk. Don't sit in a wheelchair and be dependent upon your wife, even if you and your wife value that or would prefer that. So he has this quote: "The patient who is so content to receive that he fails to do for himself everything that he can do is generally considered to be either inadequate or selfish or lacking in self-respect. To accord to another person the status of patient, of one who must be helped, is generally considered offensive. And to accord that status to oneself is generally considered demeaning." So, he has this idea that we are increasingly in the status of patient. And yet, as a society, we don't like dependence. We devalue it. We push back against it, which is creating a tension in Benson. This is sort of his final thesis statement in chapter 3. On the one hand, the social and economic organization of the Western world is developing in such a way that in ever-increasing areas and phases of life, the individual is cast in the role of patient, of recipient rather than achiever, of one who must wait and depend upon factors outside of his control. And then on another hand, that role as a whole is resented. Whenever possible, the role is repudiated, denied, or concealed, or when it must be accepted or recognized, it gives rise to frustration and a sense of affronted dignity or diminished worth. Public opinion accords the highest worth and respect to individuals who maintain and enlarge areas of human independence, who increase the possibilities of personal achievement, and to provide greater scope for private initiative. To engage people in self-reliance and self-sufficiency is really the goal of society. So that's where he leaves us off in chapter 3, the status of patient. Next week, we're going to ask the question, why does this matter? Sort of, what are our values? Why is it that it seems like we as a society push back against passion, against a status of dependence, a status of patient? What are the roots of this? And then the following week in Lent 4, we'll look at some theology. We'll sort of get God back into the picture. So this is where we are in our discussion this week. If you're watching us on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone gathered this morning, please give me a moment and we'll re-engage with our conversation.